one of the things we do is we put out these alerts right when the bills are coming, like maybe they're being heard in committee. That's the first step usually. Maybe it gets voted out of committee and now it's coming to a floor vote and, oh no, we can't stop, we got to stop this bill. Or maybe we support that bill.
Now, I know right now there's a lot of big things, being talked about as we're coming to voting day for the end of voting season. And one of them should be transportation. That's something that's a big thing. It's a big issue, in a lot of states. Now, can you give us a little bit of background on TURF and what the Grassroots organization does and stands for?
Absolutely. So we got started in Texas surrounding transportation issues because at the time our governor was Rick Perry, a Republican, and was very big on building a bunch of toll roads across the state of Texas. And he wanted to build an entire network of them. And I think the part that really got Texans stirred up about this was one, that we felt like it was a new unbridled tax on driving, that we already pay gas tax. We're like, why are we going to have to pay more? And, that was one of the aspects of it. But the thing that really got Texans under their skin was the fact that he was going to hand them over to private foreign toll corporations to run and operate for up to 50 years at a time. So it's a multi-generational shift of handing over control of our infrastructure to basically private entities that we can't control as taxpayers. And there's a lot of eminent domain issues with that, of course, because now you're basically taking land in the name of a public project like a road we normally would, but then we're handing it over to a private foreign for-profit, obviously, corporation that can basically toll you to death until the day you die, and you have no control over how high that toll rate goes. So that's what got us started. It was fighting that. And I happened to live in a corridor where one of these projects was going to come through, and they were going to take existing lanes that we already drive on today for free, if you will. Obviously, it's a gas tax funded road, but we call them freeways for a reason. You don't have to pay a toll every time you take them. And they wanted to privatize and toll it and give it over to this foreign company called Sintra. And not only the road that I used a lot, it was another road all across the north side of San Antonio that would also be wrapped into that. And then by the time we got a hold of some of the records and the open records requests and it's some of those things, we saw that there was going to be a entire network over all of San Antonio. And then, of course, we heard from other people around the state where same thing was happening in Austin and Fort Worth and Dallas, so it was a statewide thing. And so we really started organizing the Grassroots, not just in San Antonio. We started as something called the San Antonio Toll Party, which was supposed to be like a spinoff of the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party. And we went statewide in 2007. We started really in 2005, but in 2007 is when we went statewide, if you will, because we saw that this was happening everywhere. And it was to really get the state legislature's attention, we needed to have a statewide organization to do our advocacy through. So that's when TURF came about.
And now I know you've been involved for 20 years. Is that right?
In 2005, okay. In 2024, come January, it'll be 20 years.
And then how did you get started, Rachel? I know you told me that you guys met in kind of an interesting way.
Yes. So I have really not even been in politics that long, really since COVID 2019, and really looked at the federal level. And then I was really looking at public education. And I went to one of Terri's talks, and she was literally talking about Pete Buttigieg is calling the roads racist. And I was like, holy smokes. And then DEI. And I'm like, well, that's what we're fighting with the CRT and all of that in public education. And so I went up and talked to her and realized that she was a firebrand, and I needed to join her efforts. I mean, I'm just blown away at all that she's been able to accomplish. She's literally been a one-man band in Texas, and we have a lot to thank her for what all the work that she has tirelessly done for all Texans. And anyway, so I just jumped on board, and it was so funny. The first time I was going to go speak, and my mom goes, transportation? Well, what do you know about transportation? Exactly. I'm like, well, what now? I got this whole deep dive course, And anyway, I mean, it's just amazing the alerts that she puts out. I mean, if you've looked at her website, all of the news articles and things that she puts out, I mean, it is just amazing the amount of information that, I mean, she is literally a subject matter expert. Yeah.
And that's one thing we were talking about a little bit before we started, is that in this legislation and stuff like that, there's like words that a lot of people may not understand, right, that they're kind of being tricked. Like it might be something that they're not noticing when it gets passed, or sometimes they don't even know it's something that's being passed, correct?
Right. I think it's hard for the citizens that are just going about their daily lives and just trying to get to work and back and take care of their families. Don't follow the legislature very closely, and they might just get wind of things in the press if they happen to cover some of the top bills that are going through. But transportation is like a sleeper issue. It really is. Most people just take it for granted. They don't really think about, unless there's something really controversial that comes up, like maybe a project that comes through an area that people don't really want a project. That's about the only time you really hear about transportation. So I've had to educate myself and Texans, my fellow voters, about what a lot of these terms mean, to like be able to look at some of these things that happen at the local, state, and federal level so that they know what the key words are and what the terms are and the terminology they use, what types of contracts are involved. And when you start hearing these things, then you start to realize, oh, wait, that's something that's really bad for the taxpayers. I remember that. We need to fight that. And so that's kind of where it starts for a lot of people, is just educating them about what's involved. And that's what we do as a grassroots organization. We're all volunteers. I mean, I'm not paid. Rachel's not paid. But with the donations we get from just ordinary citizens across the state, one of the things we do is we put out these alerts right when the bills are coming. Like maybe they're being heard in committee. That's the first step usually. Maybe it gets voted out of committee and now it's coming to a floor vote, and oh no, we can't stop, we got to stop this bill. Or maybe we support that bill. And so we want to let people know, to make those phone calls into their state reps or their state lawmakers and make sure that we get the groundswell that we need to either get momentum or to kill a bill if it's a bad one. So that's really what we do, is inform the citizens of Texas what really is going on when they're going about their daily lives. We're reading the legislation, we're following the legislation. We know when it's coming up for a hearing, we know when it's up for a vote. And when we need testimony, we coach people on that too. I've done, anywhere from weekend conferences on just transportation, which you would think that most people don't really care much about that. But there was one particular legacy project that Rick Perry was pushing throughout the state back when he was governor, and that was called the Trans-Texas Corridor. And a lot of people knew it as kind of the NAFTA superhighway system. That's how they knew it outside of Texas, but he dubbed it the Trans-Texas Corridor. And it was a whole network of these privatized toll roads. And it wasn't just toll for cars. It was going to be toll train, which is toll rail. It was going to involve pipelines in this corridor that they were going to give to these foreign entities. It was going to have telecommunication lines. It was going to have all your fiber optics and all that you would need for internet. I mean, it was like a terrorist dream. You were going to have all the state's infrastructure, or no matter what it was, in this one corridor, and it would be out of the control of the ordinary Texan and our elected officials that we elect to watchdog these things for us and take care of them for us. So that was a really big one that people started to, have to know when were these bills up? What do we have to do? We coach them on how to, what to testify, what's involved in the contracts, and what it means for them in their everyday life, and or the farmers that were going to lose their farms to this. So it took us a number of years, from basically 2004, 2005 timeframe all the way up till 2012 before we actually got the entire chapter of the Trans-Texas Corridor out of the Transportation Code. It got repealed completely. Now, there was some litigation involved at times where we had to sue them to get some financial records. It was an organization that we partner with that I know that the Epic Times has worked with before too. It's American Stewards of Liberty, Margaret and Dan Byfield. They were one of the groups that we were working with to fight the Trans-Texas Corridor. And I believe it was their organization that fought to get the financial guts of these contracts revealed to the public, because the Texas Department of Transportation wouldn't release those documents. We had no idea what they were guaranteeing to these private organizations and entities. And we found out that they were going to have non-compete agreements. Like literally the state would not be able to build a competing free road with this foreign-owned toll road. So you can imagine what that means. I mean, now we're going to have our public infrastructure hindered based on private profits for a company that doesn't want any competition to their toll road. We were granting them monopolies. And it was an outrage. People didn't like it, so we would get into the fine-tuned details of these things. And these are some 1,200-page contracts. I mean, it took me months just to read them. But we would, give people the talking points and what to say. And we had over 800 people turn out at the Capitol to testify against the Trans-Texas Corridor. They obviously didn't even have enough time to hear from all of us. But it was a very big deal in the Texas Capitol back in those days. So we were one of the groups that helped get that repealed from the code. We followed through till the very, very end when they kept saying it was dead, but we're like, it's not dead till it's out of statute. So we got it out of statute. And we continued to work on some of the urban toll road issues where even the state was trying to hand over one corridor at a time, like maybe it's I-35 or Interstate 820 in Fort Worth. I mean, there were these specific projects. There were about 20 of them at one time where they were still pushing them, not calling it the Trans-Texas Corridor, but we're still pushing those projects. And so we've had to stay vigilant all these years, to fight for good policy and to get control back in the hands of the people's hands, which is what really is all supposed to be about. And then from there, we saw when the administrations change over time, we went from George W. Bush to, obviously we went to Barack Obama. And under the Obama administration, we started to see some new threats. And so a lot of those things we shifted and still had to deal with not only the toll issues here, but then we started to see some things where they were starting to cannibalize our road funds and give them to things that were considered more politically correct modes of travel. They started to, not like we see now, but early in the Obama administration, all the way through his 8 years, we started to see kind of this attack on cars and people that were driving alone in their vehicles. They wanted you to either carpool, get on a bus, bikes, pedestrian walkways, and all of this became where they took our road money and transferred it to those types of things that they felt were how they wanted you to get around. So we started to see it in those years, but then now under the Biden and Harris administration, it's blown up into a completely all-out war on cars.
Right. And it's the green energy. I mean, that's what they're saying, eco-friendly type of thing. But they're also, I mean, I think it's also the diversity. I mean, a lot of things have kind of come into play, I think, too, as well. Correct?
Yes. Well, Biden made the entire federal fleet of vehicles be converted over to electric. That's like 674,000 vehicles. I mean, I don't know. Did anybody remember Snowmageddon in Texas? I mean, like our electric grid cannot handle the amount that's out there now. I mean, you're going to convert just the whole federal fleet of 674,000. It's just crazy.
And let's not forget that federal fleet includes military vehicles. And so there's actually been talk recently about literally tanks being EVs. And you just got to scratch your head and go, what, you're going to be in the middle of a battlefield and have to stop your tank to charge it? I'm like, enemy. Wait until we charge our tank so that we can then start firing on you again. I mean, all these things make no sense whatsoever when it comes to common sense. But it really becomes about an ideological agenda. And it's now seeped into transportation. Like Rachel said, we've seen it in education and, healthcare, and it hit healthcare during COVID, and it really hit everybody because it was affecting every business and person and during COVID. But now we're seeing just a full bore, full throttle, if you will, attack on cars, period. And there's lots of new technologies that are available to the government through a lot of innovation that's going into cars that can now be exploited and used against drivers, which we will probably discuss at another time. But
yeah, and I know you, just to point that out, what you were talking about as far as the tolls, that's something interesting. So a lot of these tolls that they're putting in, so that money is not going back into like the city or the county or whatever. That's like for a profit for somebody else that doesn't even live here.
Now, if it's a private, one of these, what they call public-private partnerships, that's the term for them globally. That's how they're known. In Texas, they have their own name for it. As you can tell, we do our own things in Texas. So they call it a Comprehensive Development Agreement here in Texas, or CDA for short. But globally, they're known as public-private partnerships so that people, outside the Texas area would know what we're talking about. But I can tell you that these types of contracts are completely different than a publicly operated toll road, which is what most people were aware of until these started coming on the scene in the early 2000s here in America. But prior to that, all that toll money would eventually go to a public entity that could then use it to presumably build either more toll roads or more freeways for the public's benefit. But once they privatize in toll, well, now it's going to some board in Spain somewhere or some foreign corporation that takes it completely off the U.S. soil. And that money doesn't go back into our economy. So it literally is a drain on our local Texas economy. And we have some drivers today in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, as well as in the Houston area where one of these privatized toll projects exist, that are paying over $24 a day in tolls to take their route to work. that was previously a freeway. So this is a whole new unsustainable added tax to your daily commute. And it adds up to the thousands more per year in taxes, and none of that gets the benefit back into the Texas economy. It doesn't feed Texas jobs. They may have a few domestic people that help collect the tolls and do the billing and some of those types of jobs. But for the most part, those jobs are not being held by Texans. And they go to these global companies that don't care a whit about Texas or American citizens. So it's really a lose-lose, no matter how you slice it. It's the absolutely most expensive way to fund infrastructure and transportation projects. And it's the one that we've been fighting now for nearly 20 years.
And another thing was mentioned too was the eminent domain. I know that they're, doing that here in different areas in Texas and also in Florida. But what's going on with that? What are you seeing as being like a main issue?
Absolutely. It basically becomes eminent domain for private gain, right? And that's not what eminent domain is supposed to be for. Eminent domain is supposed to be in matters of public necessity. We've actually tried to change that definition in code a number of times on various pieces of legislation through the years. There's been a lot of different iterations of eminent domain legislation that's come through since all of this came on the scene. But that's one of the reasons why we look into that and fight for those particular bills. A lot of people are saying, well, what do you have to do with property rights and, eminent domain? What does that have to do with transportation and toll roads here? And it was like, well, because now you're presumably taking the land for a public project, but now it's becoming a private project for a for-profit company. Nobody should lose their land, forcibly have their land taken from them by the government in order to hand it to somebody else that can now make money from your land that you're now cut out of that. So it's a huge eminent domain abuse problem. And it also really affects just property rights in general, right? Do we really own our property when the government can come take it for any purpose? And what we've seen happen in some of these projects, if they, let's say the public is successful in stopping one of these private toll projects, well, now we have trouble at getting the Department of Transportation to give that land back to the original landowner. So we've had to address some legislation through the years that says if you haven't used that land for its intended purpose within 10 years, then you have to give it back and sell it back to them at the rate you paid them for it. No inflation added on and none of that. You're supposed to, literally you're supposed to have the chance to buy that back from the government because they took it for one purpose. And what they were doing was they were flipping it to another purpose. So if that project didn't go through, they'd sell it to some other state entity that might put a building there instead of a road through there. And so we see this property swapping and this basically just huge abuses with property rights in our through eminent domain policy in Texas. So we've been having to tighten that down for a good 15 years or more in the state of Texas. And while they're trying to get a control of how many entities that we found out through that process, that there were literally hundreds of private entities that had the ability to use the governmental power of eminent domain in Texas. And so we finally had to do one bill. Senator Lois Kolkhorst was one of the representatives on the forefront of this. And they literally had to pass a bill first to find out even who these entities were that had this power, because they had so many people come to the committee when they were doing this bill that says, we're going to lock down who can have the power to use this and what for. All these private entities were coming out of the woodwork to the committee saying, well, we have the power of eminent domain. How does this affect us? So we literally had to say, if you have the power of eminent domain, you have to report it to, and I want to say it was like it was some federal state agency. I don't even remember which one it was, but they had to literally reveal who they were, and they got a list back that was hundreds of private entities that have the power of eminent domain in Texas, which is a huge problem. It is supposed to be an inherently governmental power only, and to give it to a private for-profit corporation for them to utilize for their own, for-profit projects is just insane. It does not protect our property rights and that are enshrined in our Constitution. And so we have had to get on the forefront of some of those issues through the years as well.
Well, and they also don't have to adhere to the same laws and standards that, a Texas company would have to. And so during Snowmageddon, when they had that, how many car pileup was it in Dallas?
133 car pileup on a private
on
toll.
The toll in Dallas. Mm-hmm. The private company did not weatherize the road properly. That's what caused that. And so,
because they're a for-profit company, right? They're not TxDOT. Our Department of Transportation that is one thing they do very well. They know how to weatherize the roads in the various regions across Texas. I mean, we have a very diverse climate just throughout our state because we're a huge landmass, right? So you might have desert, you might have swampy land in East Texas, you can have, very arid, semi-arid, and then you've got North Texas, they can have lots of snow and ice. So, they know how to weatherize those roads. They know when it's time to close a road if it's unsafe for the citizens to drive on. But when you now privatize and hand over that jurisdiction and control of that road to a private for-profit entity that doesn't even live in Texas, doesn't even live in the United States, and put them in charge of weatherizing a road that's unique to our state, we figured out real fast what that means. It means deadly consequences. We had 6 people die in that 133-car pileup with the snowstorm in 2021, and they have yet to pay the price for it. Now, there's lots of lawsuits flying around from the victims and their families, but that doesn't bring those Texans back. I mean, we had deadly consequences by putting profit into our public infrastructure, and we really we can't allow that to continue here in Texas, that's for sure. And we would encourage anyone that's listening that maybe is not in Texas, that you need to be watching for this in your state as well, because the private global companies that want to get a hold of public infrastructure, they're government monopolies, and it's the gift that keeps on giving. The other thing we found in these contracts is that you and I, the taxpayer, guarantee the profits of these private entities. Well, that's why they want in on that game, because very few people get guaranteed profits. In a private, free market, private sector world, you have to compete with your competitors in order to get that profit. And you don't have any of those forces when it's a government-sanctioned monopoly like a single highway that you give to these private corporations. And so we were finding that there was major taxpayer subsidies. We found through all the different documents in that kind of 2012 timeframe, between 2007 and 2012, the state had subsidized these toll projects to the tune of $10 billion. So that's a lot of public money that could build a lot of public freeways that were now being for the sole benefit of these private corporations. And so we had to put a stop to that. We did. In 2017, we had an amendment passed onto a bill that stopped the public subsidies from going to these private toll projects. So that was very good. That was a big win for us.
So this is something definitely other states, we were talking about Florida's a big state. I think it's having a lot of the same issues that are starting to happen, but people need to start kind of like opening their eyes and really kind of seeing what's going on here.
Absolutely. And we just had so kind of some good news. It was a new development. Now, we warned them about this before it happened. So that's kind of, I feel a little bit vindicated after all these years of fighting this, that what we said would happen just happened. And so in the Houston area, it's kind of more Galveston Bay area, but it's Highway 288. It was one of the last public-private partnership contracts to be signed in Texas. It was under Greg Abbott. He really is the one that put the stop to it when he came in as governor, but this is the last one that got signed kind of right as he came into office. And that project has only been open now for just a few years, and they are already having such high toll rates being charged to commuters, and they are making such a huge stink about it down there, that the highway department decided that they want to buy back that project from the private toll entity so that it's now in the state's hands so that they can start to control that toll rate, because it was just out of control. And so we were understanding that there's people paying $24 or more one way to use this project during peak hours, because that's what's happened now is they do something called congestion pricing. And so congestion pricing means that you pay more to drive. Your toll rate is higher during peak hours or when it's congested. That's basically what that means. So it's a congestion tax. And so you're going to be paying sometimes $1, $2, in some cases $3 to $4 per mile to drive on one of these privatized toll roads during peak hours. Well, the average middle-class working person doesn't have a choice of when their schedule is. They don't get to drive when it's off-peak hours. They have to get to work at a certain time frame, and they don't have a choice. So it really is like having you over a barrel. That's why these are, monopolies. They work out great for the private entities, but they don't work out so well for the drivers. So starting last Friday, November 1st, the state took that project back. They just decided as the Transportation Commission to purchase that project back. Now, here's the part that we talked about. We try to get them to not sign these contracts because now the state had to pay $1.7 billion in our state funds to buy back that project that the state could have just built itself in the first place. And so, yes, we have it back in the public's hands. And yes, TxDOT's going to be lowering that toll rate for commuters, but they're still going to be paying back some pretty hefty tolls for a very long time if the state had just prioritized the funds and done it like they usually do and make it a freeway. We wouldn't have to be paying these very severe consequences for the people in that corridor.
Right. A big price to pay for something that could have been avoided. And I know you were talking about, one thing we were talking about too, to bring up kill switch. I've never heard that term before. What does that mean and what is that?
Rachel, you want to take that?
I mean, it's literally the government has mandated in the Biden infrastructure plan bill that went out in 2021. I think it was like 1,039 pages. It mandates a remote kill switch. It's under the guise of drunk driving. It's mandated in all vehicles starting in 2026, which is literally right around the corner. And they have it under the guise of drunk driving. However, correct me if I'm wrong, Terri, I think there's like 38 states that already have an aftermarket breathalyzer. After you've been found guilty, you've had your due process in court, and then you're mandated to use that breathalyzer. This would literally turn every vehicle, it's against your Fourth Amendment constitutional right. They are literally suspecting every American citizen of drunk driving.
Right. It's basically unconstitutional. In our view, it's totally against your Fourth Amendment rights, right? Because they are not allowed to surveil you without a warrant. And essentially, the technology that this requires in order for them to cut off power to your car, it's basically a remote kill switch technology. Now, people that have EVs, particularly Teslas, are used to having something like this. But it's in the hands of the driver, the owner of the car, and it's an anti-theft device. It basically means if your Tesla gets stolen, you basically, as the owner, have on your key fob the ability to press like a switch that keeps your car from being able to start, so that it discourages people from trying to steal your car because they know they aren't going to be able to drive it very far because you're going to have the ability to kill the power to that car by using that type of technology. But what we're talking about that passed in this legislation, it was the Biden infrastructure bill. It happened in his first year in office, like Rachel said. It passed when Nancy Pelosi was in charge of the House. It was one of the cram downs, as they are known. My congressman is Chip Roy, and he likes to call it that, where literally there was no debate, no amendments. It really did not go through the normal committee process at all. The bill shows up. It's over 1,000 pages, and they were told they had to vote on it within 24 hours of it being released. So obviously nobody knew what was in it, including the members of the Transportation Committee. So in their defense, here they'd been working on these projects for many, many years. It takes usually 6 to 10 years to do a federal transportation bill. And they had it all, the House especially didn't have anything from their version of the transportation bill they had been working on in this legislation at all. And so we find almost a year later, it was about 8 months later, I find out and get wind about this kill switch provision in the bill. And now we know, Rachel and I went up to Washington, D.C. last year around in September because the Texas legislature also met last year. We meet every 2 years in Texas. So we had met earlier in the year, and that was one of our big legislative priorities was to get a bill to protect Texans from this kill switch going into their cars. We didn't even get a hearing on that bill. And so since we got nowhere in Texas, we're like, well, really, this is a federal mandate. So let's go up to D.C. and see what we can get done. And at the time, they were starting to take up what's called regular order of business in the U.S. House. Under McCarthy, that was one of the big things that they had negotiated with him was to start going through each appropriation bill one at a time instead of just passing continuing resolution after continuing resolution to fund the federal government. It was time to really drill down into what are we spending on these agencies? They need to start defending each line item to us before we just start funding these things. And so one of the bills we got lucky at the timing we went up there was coming up very quickly was the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Bill. It's known as THUD in Congress. And so that THUD bill was coming up quickly, and we came up with the idea of having an amendment added to that bill, which funding bills always have to pass, right? So that would be a good vehicle to add an amendment to that would defund this kill switch. And so we worked offices like you can't imagine. We went to nearly 100 offices in a matter of 4 days. We met with and spoke with every Republican on both of those committees, as well as the Appropriations Committee that deals with the transportation bills, as well as each House's transportation, both the Senate and the House, and met with them. And they all got a letter from over 200 grassroots groups here in Texas that signed on to this saying, we don't want this kill switch, repeal the kill switch. So that always takes notice, at least for the Sunbelt states and a lot of the Republican states, red states, if you will. What Texas does, they tend to follow. Texas and Florida kind of lead on policy when it comes to most things, because they want to know what these big, more successful, if you will, visible red states are doing. So when you bring in a note to some of these guys in, lot smaller states with over 200 grassroots groups signed on saying, we want you to repeal this, that gets their attention. And what was crazy, and Rachel, you can speak to this for a bit if you want, is the lack of knowledge, even among our own Republican members of Congress, as to the fact that this was even passed in the bill. They didn't even know it was law.